courtroom camera captured a moment so absurd, so perfectly orchestrated for disaster, that it would become the most replayed clip in Judge Judy's 25-year television history. Karen Henderson strutted through those double doors like she was walking into her own coronation, her designer handbag swinging with each confident step, her perfectly highlighted hair bouncing with the kind of energy that screamed entitlement. But it wasn't Karen alone that made this entrance legendary. Behind her, struggling to keep pace while clutching an oversized briefcase that looked like it came from a discount store, was the man she introduced to everyone as my attorney, Michael Bradford. The way she said those words with such smug satisfaction, such absolute certainty that she had outsmarted the system, would haunt her for the rest of her life. What Karen Henderson didn't know, as she settled into the defendant's chair with that infuriating smirk, was that Judge Judy had spent the previous evening making phone calls that would expose the biggest courtroom fraud in television history. She didn't know that the single question Judge Judy was preparing to ask would destroy not just her case, but her entire world. She had no idea that in less than 15 minutes, she would be sobbing uncontrollably while her lawyer was being escorted out in handcuffs, facing multiple felony charges that would send him to prison for years. This wasn't just another case about a property dispute. This was about to become a masterclass in what happens when arrogance meets accountability, when fraud meets justice, and when someone stupid enough to bring a fake lawyer into Judge Judy's courtroom learns why that's the worst decision anyone could ever make. Before we dive into the complete and utter destruction of Karen and her fake lawyer, you need to hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to witness will restore your faith in the justice system. This is the moment when two con artists thought they could outsmart America's toughest judge and, instead, walked straight into a trap that had been carefully set from the very first second they entered her courtroom. Trust me, the devastation that's coming will leave you speechless, and you won't want to miss a single second of this epic takedown. 23. Karen Henderson had been terrorizing her neighborhood in suburban Phoenix for 3 years. At 42 years old, she had perfected the art of using the legal system as a weapon against anyone who dared to cross her. Her latest victim was Maria Chen, a 68-year-old retired teacher who lived next door and had made the fatal mistake of politely asking Karen to stop parking her car across Maria's driveway. That simple, reasonable request had triggered a campaign of harassment that would make any reasonable person's blood boil. Karen had responded by building a fence, not on her own property line, but 3 feet into Maria's yard, deliberately blocking access to Maria's garden where she grew vegetables to supplement her fixed income. When Maria protested, Karen had smiled sweetly and said she'd see her in court, confident that her secret weapon would guarantee victory. That secret weapon was Michael Bradford, a man she'd found through a Facebook advertisement that promised professional legal representation at a fraction of traditional lawyer costs. The ad had been clever, deliberately vague, using phrases like legal expertise and courtroom experience without ever technically claiming he was a licensed attorney. But Karen, blinded by her desire to win at any cost, had seen what she wanted to see. She had paid Michael Bradford $3,500 up front, a sum that Maria could never afford, which was exactly what Karen was counting on. Bradford had promised her guaranteed victory, claimed he had 15 years of courtroom experience, and assured her that he knew exactly how to handle judges like Judy Shendlin. He'd spent 2 weeks coaching Karen on what to say, feeding her pseudo-legal terminology that sounded impressive to someone with no actual legal knowledge, and building her confidence to dangerous levels. He told her that Judge Judy was just a TV personality, not a real judge anymore, and that her bark was worse than her bite. He'd promised Karen that together they would not only win the case, but humiliate Maria Chen so badly that she'd probably just move away and solve Karen's neighbor problem permanently. What neither of them knew was that Judge Judy had been a family court judge in New York for 25 years before her television career, had presided over more than 20,000 cases, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot liars, frauds, and con artists within 30 seconds of meeting them. The moment Judge Judy's researchers had received the case file and seen that Karen was being represented by someone called Michael Bradford from Bradford Legal Services, red flags had gone up immediately. A quick search of the State Bar website showed no attorney by that name licensed in Arizona. An expanded search of all 50 states came up empty. Judge Judy's team had gone deeper, discovering that Michael Bradford ran a business that carefully skirted the line between legal consulting and practicing law without a license. They found his website filled with testimonials from satisfied clients who praised his legal knowledge, his courtroom skills, and his ability to win cases that other lawyers wouldn't take. But nowhere on that website, buried in disclaimers written in tiny font at the bottom of pages most people never read, did it explicitly state that Michael Bradford was a licensed attorney. It said he provided legal services, legal representation, and courtroom advocacy. But the word attorney never appeared except in the phrase, "not a substitute for hiring an attorney," hidden where desperate people looking for cheap legal help would never bother to look. Judge Judy had seen this scam before, but never so brazenly walked into her own courtroom. She had made phone calls to the Arizona State Bar, to the district attorney's office, and to 3 other people who had hired Bradford and later discovered he wasn't actually a lawyer. One of those people had lost their house because Bradford's incompetent legal advice had caused them to miss critical filing deadlines. Another had been sanctioned by a judge for submitting documents that Bradford had prepared, documents so poorly written and legally nonsensical that the judge suspected fraud. By the time Karen Henderson and Michael Bradford walked into her courtroom that morning, Judge Judy knew everything. She knew he was a fraud. She knew Karen had paid him $3,500. She knew he'd been running this scam for at least 3 years. And she had already decided that this case would end with both of them facing consequences they never saw coming. The morning of the taping, Karen had posted on Facebook about her upcoming appearance on Judge Judy, bragging to her friends that she had hired a real lawyer who would expose the show as rigged entertainment. She'd included a selfie of herself and Bradford standing outside the studio, both of them smiling confidently, Karen holding up a peace sign like she was heading to a party instead of a courtroom. The comments on that post were filled with her friends encouraging her, telling her to destroy Judge Judy, to show them who's boss, and predicting her viral fame when the episode aired. Karen had responded to every comment, building her confidence higher and higher, never once stopping to wonder why a lawyer charging a fraction of normal rates hadn't asked for any retainer agreement, why he'd never sent her any official documents from a law firm, or why his business card listed a Gmail address instead of a professional domain. She had wanted to believe she'd found a loophole, a way to get professional representation without paying professional prices, and that desire had blinded her to every warning sign screaming that something was very wrong. Michael Bradford had spent the morning before the taping coaching Karen one final time in the studio parking lot. He'd reminded her to let him do most of the talking, to nod seriously when he cited legal precedents that he'd made up, and to maintain an expression of righteous confidence no matter what Judge Judy said. He'd assured her that television judges were limited in what they could actually do, that this was all for entertainment, and that as long as they stuck to the script he prepared, they'd walk away with a victory and the $5,000 maximum judgment that Karen was seeking from Maria Chen. What Bradford hadn't told Karen was that he'd failed out of law school after 1 semester, that he'd never taken the bar exam, and that every single case he'd handled over the past 3 years had either been settled out of court by desperate clients who didn't know any better, or had resulted in default judgments because his legal filings were so incompetent that judges simply ignored them. He'd been counting on the fact that most people were too embarrassed to admit they'd been scammed, too financially drained to pursue legal action against him, or too ignorant about the law to realize he had no idea what he was doing. He'd gotten away with it dozens of times before, and his arrogance had grown with each successful con. Walking into Judge Judy's courtroom was the single biggest mistake of his criminal career. The case was scheduled as a standard 15-minute segment, but producers had been quietly told to keep the cameras rolling no matter what happened. Judge Judy had informed them that this case might run longer than usual and that what was about to unfold needed to be captured in its entirety. The audience had been seated, a mix of retired folks and daytime TV enthusiasts who'd waited months for tickets to watch their favorite judge in action. They had no idea they were about to witness television history, that the episode they'd watch being taped would be shared over 50 million times across every social media platform within 48 hours of airing. Maria Chen sat in the plaintiff's chair, a small, dignified woman in a simple dress, clutching a folder of documents that proved Karen's fence was illegally built on her property. She looked terrified, intimidated by Karen's expensive clothes and professional representation, convinced that she was about to lose everything because she couldn't afford a real lawyer to defend her rights. Judge Judy entered the courtroom with her signature no-nonsense stride, her black robe flowing behind her as she took her seat at the bench. The audience stood respectfully, then settled back into their seats as she arranged her papers with the precise movements of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, taking in every detail with the practiced assessment of a predator surveying the landscape. She looked at Maria Chen with a brief nod of acknowledgement, then let her gaze settle on Karen Henderson and the man sitting beside her at the defendant's table. Judge Judy's expression revealed nothing, but everyone who had watched her show for years knew that slight narrowing of her eyes meant she had already formed an opinion, and it wasn't favorable. The bailiff announced the case, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom. Case number 4287, Maria Chen versus Karen Henderson. The plaintiff is suing for $5,000 for the cost of removing an illegally constructed fence and damages to her property. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face as she addressed the plaintiff first. Ms. Chen, tell me in your own words why we're here today. Maria's voice trembled as she began to speak, describing how she had lived peacefully in her home for 15 years before Karen Henderson moved in next door 3 years ago. She explained how the relationship had started cordially but deteriorated after she asked Karen to stop parking across her driveway. She described coming home from her weekly grocery shopping to find construction workers building a fence that cut directly through her vegetable garden, destroying tomato plants and herb beds she had been cultivating for years. When she confronted Karen, she was told that the fence was on Karen's property, and that if Maria had a problem with it, she could hire a surveyor to prove otherwise. Maria did exactly that, spending $800 she could barely afford on a professional survey that confirmed the fence was indeed 3 feet onto her property. When she showed Karen the survey results, Karen laughed in her face and told her to take it to court if she was so sure she was right. Judge Judy listened intently, occasionally making notes, her expression growing colder with each detail of Karen's harassment. When Maria finished, her voice breaking as she described having to give up the garden that had been her pride and joy, Judge Judy turned her attention to the defendant's table. Ms. Henderson, I see you've brought representation with you today. Mr. Bradford, is it? Her tone was neutral, almost pleasant, but anyone familiar with Judge Judy's courtroom style recognized this as the calm before the storm. Michael Bradford stood up with practiced confidence, smoothing his cheap tie and clearing his throat importantly. Yes, Your Honor. Michael Bradford of Bradford Legal Services, representing Ms. Henderson in this matter. He spoke with the kind of affected authority that came from watching too many legal dramas on television. His voice deeper than natural, his posture exaggeratedly professional. Judge Judy's eyebrows raised slightly. Bradford Legal Services. And where is your office located, Mr. Bradford? It seemed like an innocent question, the kind of small talk that might happen before getting to the substance of the case. Bradford's confident smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he recovered. I operate primarily out of the greater Phoenix metropolitan area, Your Honor, though I serve clients throughout Arizona. It was a deliberately vague answer, the kind that sounded specific, but said nothing. Judge Judy made a note on her pad, then gestured for him to continue. And you're here today to defend your client against Ms. Chen's allegations regarding this fence? Bradford launched into his opening statement with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed he was impressing everyone in the room. He spoke about property rights and the importance of homeowners being able to make improvements to their land without harassment from neighbors. He used phrases like pursuant to applicable statutes and relevant case law establishes, without ever citing any specific statutes or cases. He talked about how Karen Henderson was a respected member of her community who had acted in good faith based on her understanding of the property boundaries. He claimed that the survey Maria had obtained was from a disreputable company known for producing inaccurate results to generate disputes. Every few sentences, he would glance at Karen, who nodded along enthusiastically, her smug smile growing wider with each pseudo-legal phrase he delivered. Judge Judy let him talk, her expression unchanging, occasionally jotting notes, but never interrupting. Normally, Judge Judy would have cut off this kind of rambling within 30 seconds, but she was letting Bradford hang himself with his own words. When Bradford finally finished, clearly pleased with his own performance, Judge Judy leaned forward slightly. Mr. Bradford, that was quite a presentation. Tell me, in your 15 years of legal experience, how many cases have you personally tried? It seemed like a reasonable question. Bradford's confident smile stayed fixed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. Well, Your Honor, I've handled numerous cases across various jurisdictions, primarily focused on achieving favorable settlements rather than proceeding to trial. In my experience, a skilled legal professional can often negotiate outcomes that serve everyone's interests. It was another non-answer, a string of impressive-sounding words that avoided the actual question. Judge Judy smiled slightly. That's very diplomatic of you, Mr. Bradford, but I asked you a specific question. How many cases have you personally tried in court? The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop. Bradford shifted his weight, clutching his briefcase tighter. Your Honor, if we could perhaps focus on the merits of the current case rather than my professional background, I believe we could resolve this matter more efficiently. It was a mistake. Everyone in the courtroom knew it except for Bradford and Karen. You don't deflect Judge Judy's questions. Judge Judy's expression hardened. Mr. Bradford, I didn't ask you what you thought was efficient. I asked you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. How many cases have you personally tried in a courtroom? Silence followed. Bradford's face began to redden, beads of sweat forming along his hairline. Your Honor, I believe my track record speaks for itself. My clients have consistently expressed satisfaction with the outcomes I've achieved. Judge Judy slammed her hand down on her desk. That's 3 times now you've avoided a simple question. Let me try another one. Where did you attend law school, Mr. Bradford? Karen's smile finally faded. She looked at her lawyer with growing concern, noticing the sweat, the stammering, the shaking hands. This wasn't how she imagined it would go. I attended a very prestigious institution, Your Honor, Bradford said weakly, one with a strong focus on practical legal application rather than purely theoretical study. Judge Judy leaned back, that predatory smile appearing. A prestigious institution? How interesting. What year were you admitted to the bar, Mr. Bradford? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Bradford's face drained of color. Your Honor, I'm not sure how my credentials are relevant to this case about a property dispute. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Even those unfamiliar with law knew that refusing to answer was suspicious. Karen sat rigid, her smugness gone, replaced by dawning horror. Judge Judy raised her hand, silencing the room. Let me help you out, Mr. Bradford. Your credentials are relevant because I spent yesterday evening making some very interesting phone calls. I contacted the Arizona State Bar Association. Would you like to know what they told me? Bradford's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His briefcase slipped from his hands and hit the floor with a loud thud. They told me there is no attorney named Michael Bradford licensed to practice law in the state of Arizona, so I expanded my search. I called the bar associations in California, Nevada, New Mexico, and Texas. Nothing. I had my research team search the national database of licensed attorneys. Your name appears nowhere. Karen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the reality hit her. She turned to Bradford, panic in her eyes. Michael, tell her. Tell her you're a lawyer. Show her your license. But Bradford was frozen, his face ashen, his world crumbling in real time. Judge Judy wasn't finished. She picked up a folder from her desk. I also spoke with the district attorney's office. They were very interested to learn that someone has been practicing law without a license in their jurisdiction. And I spoke with 3 of your former clients, or should I say victims, people who paid you thousands for representation only to discover you have no legal training whatsoever. The courtroom exploded in gasps and exclamations. The audience leaned forward, riveted. This had gone from a simple property dispute to criminal fraud unfolding live on national television. More time, Mr. Bradford, and I suggest you think very carefully before you answer. Are you or are you not a licensed attorney? The seconds that followed felt like hours. Michael Bradford stood there, his cheap suit now visibly damp with sweat, his hands trembling, his face a mask of trapped desperation. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke the words that would seal both his and Karen's fate. No, Your Honor, I'm not a licensed attorney. The courtroom erupted in chaos. People were shouting, gasping, some even standing up in their shock. The bailiff moved closer to Bradford, his hand resting on his radio. Karen Henderson let out a wail that could probably be heard in the parking lot, her carefully constructed facade of superiority shattering into a million pieces. She lunged at Bradford, her designer handbag swinging wildly. You told me you were a lawyer. You said you had 15 years of experience. I paid you $3,500, you lying piece of trash. The bailiff had to physically restrain Karen as she screamed at Bradford, her face contorted with rage and humiliation. Bradford just stood there, accepting her fury with the defeated posture of someone who knew there was no way out, no escape from the consequences that were about to rain down on him like a biblical plague. Judge Judy's gavel came down 3 times, sharp cracks that cut through the pandemonium and restored order to her courtroom. Sit down, Ms. Henderson, right now. Karen collapsed back into her chair, her rage giving way to heaving sobs as the full weight of her situation became clear. She had brought a fake lawyer into Judge Judy's courtroom. She had paid him $3,500 to perpetrate a fraud. And now she was implicated in that fraud on national television in front of millions of viewers who would watch this episode and remember her name forever. Judge Judy's voice cut through the courtroom like a scalpel through flesh, cold and precise and absolutely merciless. Mr. Bradford, you have been operating a criminal enterprise for at least 3 years, defrauding vulnerable people who came to you for legal help. You charged them attorney fees. You filed documents in court. You represented yourself as having legal expertise you do not possess. That's not just unauthorized practice of law. That's fraud, theft, and criminal impersonation. She turned to the bailiff without breaking her stride. "Officer, please detain Mr. Bradford. I'm holding him for the authorities, who I believe are waiting outside this courtroom right now." Two uniformed police officers entered through the side door as if on cue, and they were indeed waiting, their presence confirming that Judge Judy had orchestrated this entire takedown with the precision of a military operation. Bradford's legs seemed to give out as the officers approached, and he had to be held upright as they placed handcuffs on his wrists. The clicking sound of the cuffs locking echoed through the silent courtroom like a death knell. Karen watched in absolute horror as her lawyer, the man she trusted to win her case and humiliate her elderly neighbor, was led away in handcuffs, his head hanging in defeat, his cheap suit rumpled and sweat-stained, his briefcase left abandoned on the courtroom floor like evidence at a crime scene. But Judge Judy wasn't done with Karen Henderson. Not even close. She turned her full attention to the sobbing woman in the defendant's chair, and her expression held no sympathy whatsoever. "Ms. Henderson, let's talk about your role in this fraud." Karen's head snapped up, tears streaming down her face, her makeup running in dark streaks that made her look like a melting wax figure. "I'm a victim here too. I didn't know he wasn't a real lawyer. He told me he was licensed. I paid him good money." Her voice was high and desperate, the voice of someone drowning and grasping at any lifeline, no matter how flimsy. Judge Judy's expression suggested she was having none of it. "Did you verify his bar license? Did you check the state bar website? Did you ask to see any credentials whatsoever?" Karen's silence was answer enough. "Let me guess. He charged you significantly less than a real attorney would charge. He promised you things that sounded too good to be true, and you didn't ask questions because you liked what he was telling you. You wanted someone who would help you bully your elderly neighbor, someone who would support your illegal fence and your harassment campaign, and you didn't care whether he was actually qualified as long as he gave you what you wanted." The accuracy of Judge Judy's assessment hit Karen like a physical blow. She tried to stammer out a response, but Judge Judy silenced her with a raised hand. "I looked into your background too, Ms. Henderson. This isn't your first frivolous lawsuit. You've sued 3 other neighbors over the past 2 years, small claims cases that you won by default because your neighbors couldn't afford lawyers and didn't show up to court. You've been using the legal system as a weapon to terrorize people in your community, and you thought bringing a fake lawyer to my courtroom would help you continue that pattern." Judge Judy picked up the survey that Maria Chen had submitted as evidence. The professional document that clearly showed Karen's fence was built 3 feet onto Maria's property. This survey is from a reputable company with 40 years of experience. "The fence you built is illegal. You knew it was illegal when you built it. You did it deliberately to harass Ms. Chen after she had the audacity to ask you to stop parking across her driveway. And when she proved you were wrong, you paid a con man $3,500 to help you continue your harassment in my courtroom." Karen's sobs had intensified to the point where she could barely breathe, her whole body shaking with the force of her breakdown. The woman who had walked into the courtroom with such confidence, such arrogance, such certainty that she would humiliate her victim on national television had been reduced to a pathetic, crying mess who would forever be remembered as the woman stupid enough to bring a fake lawyer to Judge Judy's courtroom. Judge Judy's final ruling was swift and devastating, delivered with the finality of an executioner's axe. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $5,000, which represents the cost of removing your illegal fence, repairing the damage to Ms. Chen's property, and compensation for the harassment she has endured. Additionally, Ms. Henderson, I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into your potential criminal liability for knowingly working with someone engaged in the unauthorized practice of law. If they determine you knew or should have known that Mr. Bradford was not a licensed attorney, you could face criminal charges as an accessory to fraud. The courtroom erupted in applause. Maria Chen, who had sat quietly through the entire proceeding, collapsed into tears of relief and vindication. After 3 years of harassment, after being bulldozed by her entitled neighbor, after having her garden destroyed and her peace shattered, justice had finally been served in the most spectacular way imaginable. Judge Judy's final words were directed at the camera, speaking to the millions of viewers who would watch this episode. Let this be a lesson to everyone watching. If you're going to hire a lawyer, verify their credentials. It takes 30 seconds to check the State Bar website. And if someone is charging you significantly less than market rates while promising guaranteed victories, that's a red flag the size of Texas. Use your common sense. And to those who think they can use the legal system to bully and harass others, remember that karma has perfect timing, and it always catches up with you eventually. The gavel came down one final time, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot, officially ending the case and sealing Karen Henderson's fate. Within hours of the episode airing, the clip had exploded across every social media platform. The moment when Bradford admitted he wasn't a lawyer, Karen's screaming breakdown, and Judge Judy's devastating takedown were shared over 50 million times. The fake lawyer Karen trended worldwide for 3 days straight. Legal experts used the case as a teaching example in law schools about the importance of verifying credentials and the serious consequences of unauthorized practice of law. News outlets from CNN to Fox News covered the story, interviewing legal ethics professors about how someone like Bradford could operate for 3 years without being caught. Michael Bradford was ultimately charged with 15 counts of fraud, theft, and unauthorized practice of law. His trial revealed that he had defrauded over 20 clients out of more than $65,000, and that several of those clients had lost cases, houses, and custody battles because of his incompetent legal advice. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to his victims. Karen Henderson faced her own legal consequences, not just from Judge Judy's ruling, but from the Arizona State Bar's investigation into whether she had knowingly participated in Bradford's fraud. While criminal charges were ultimately not filed against her, the $5,000 judgment combined with the loss of the $3,500 she'd paid, Bradford essentially bankrupted her. More devastating than the financial cost was the social cost. Her face became synonymous with entitled stupidity. Her neighbors, who had tolerated her harassment for years, now openly celebrated her downfall. She was forced to remove the illegal fence at her own expense, and Maria Chen's garden was restored to its former glory with the help of community volunteers who had seen the episode and wanted to support her. Karen eventually sold her house and moved to another state, but even there, people recognized her from the viral video, and her reputation followed her like a shadow she could never escape. The case became legendary in the annals of courtroom television, studied by communication scholars as the perfect example of how investigative journalism and entertainment can intersect to expose real fraud and deliver real justice. Judge Judy's methodical destruction of Bradford's facade reminded viewers that justice isn't just about legal technicalities. It's about holding people accountable for their actions and protecting vulnerable people from predators who would exploit them. Tanindu. If you loved watching Judge Judy absolutely destroy a fake lawyer and his entitled client, make sure you smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss another epic takedown. Comment below and tell me what you think should happen to people who impersonate lawyers to scam vulnerable victims. Should the penalties be even harsher? And share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that trying to outsmart the system always ends badly, especially when you're stupid enough to try it in Judge Judy's courtroom. The next Karen takedown is coming soon, and trust me, it's going to be even more satisfying than this one. The courtroom fell silent. Karen Richardson stood before Judge Judy with a smile that would haunt millions of viewers. Her Her designer suit was pressed to perfection, her blonde highlights catching the studio lights just right, and her leather portfolio clutched against her chest like a shield of invincibility. Then she said the 5 words that would destroy her life forever. "You can't touch me, Judge." The words hung in the air like poison, and what happened next became the most replayed courtroom moment in internet history, shared over 30 million times in just 48 hours. But what Karen didn't know as she stood there with that smug smile plastered across her face was that Judge Judy had spent the previous night uncovering secrets that would expose her lies, her crimes, and her pattern of predatory behavior on national television in front of millions of witnesses. Before revealing Judge Judy's legendary response that went viral across every social media platform imaginable, make sure you hit that like button if you're ready to see the ultimate entitled Karen get absolutely demolished by America's toughest judge. And don't forget to subscribe, because what you're about to witness isn't just another courtroom dispute. This is the moment when a career criminal who thought she was untouchable discovered that arrogance always comes with a price, and that price was about to be paid in the most public, most humiliating way possible. This wasn't just another HOA dispute or parking lot argument that filled the typical Judge Judy docket. This was about a woman who had been systematically exploiting the most vulnerable members of society for years, believing that her wealth, her connections, and her attorney husband made her completely immune to consequences. Karen Richardson had perfected the art of the long con, targeting elderly homeowners who trusted her fake consulting business, stealing their life savings with a smile, and then disappearing before they even realized they'd been scammed. She had done this not once, not twice, but at least 12 times that investigators knew about, accumulating over $200,000 in stolen money from seniors who could least afford to lose it. Karen thought walking into Judge Judy's courtroom would be just another performance, another chance to use her polished professionalism and legal jargon to confuse and intimidate her victim into silence. She had talked her way out of trouble dozens of times before, always managing to make herself appear like a reasonable businesswoman, and her victims like confused elderly people who simply didn't understand how the world worked. Her husband, a successful attorney at a prestigious law firm, had always been there to clean up her messes, sending threatening letters to anyone who dared complain, making problems disappear with the wave of expensive legal stationery. She had operated in the gray areas of the law for so long that she genuinely believed she had found the perfect crime. A way to steal from people who were too embarrassed, too confused, or too intimidated to fight back. But Judge Judy Sheindlin had built her legendary reputation on one unshakable principle that had terrified con artists and manipulators for over 25 years. She didn't care about your polish, your professionalism, or your expensive attorney husband. She cared about truth, evidence, and holding predators accountable for the pain they caused. Karen Richardson was about to discover that her carefully constructed facade of respectability was about to be ripped apart on national television, piece by piece, lie by lie, scam by scam. Judge Judy had been setting a trap from the moment she reviewed the case file, and Karen had walked right into it with the kind of arrogant confidence that only comes from years of getting away with crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. To understand the magnitude of Karen Richardson's cruelty, you need to meet Margaret Chen, the 73-year-old widow sitting in the plaintiff's chair with trembling hands and eyes red from sleepless nights. Margaret had been a school teacher for 42 years, dedicating her life to educating children in her local elementary school, touching thousands of young lives with patience and kindness. She had married her high school sweetheart, Thomas, and together they had built a modest but comfortable life, saving every penny they could to buy their dream home in a quiet neighborhood where they planned to spend their golden years together. But 2 years ago, Thomas died suddenly from a heart attack, leaving Margaret alone in that house filled with memories, living on a fixed income from her teacher's pension and Social Security that barely covered her monthly expenses. When a severe storm damaged Margaret's roof last spring, she was devastated. Water leaked into her bedroom, ruining the ceiling and threatening to destroy the home she and Thomas had worked so hard to buy. She didn't understand insurance claims or contractor negotiations. She had always relied on Thomas to handle those complicated matters. Now she was alone, scared, and completely overwhelmed by the technical language and endless paperwork that home repairs seemed to require. That's when Karen Richardson appeared, like an angel of mercy, or so Margaret thought at the time. Karen had knocked on her door with a warm smile, a professional business card, and an offer that seemed too good to be true. A free consultation to help seniors navigate the complex world of insurance claims and home repairs. Karen told Margaret that elderly homeowners were often taken advantage of by dishonest contractors, and that her consulting business existed specifically to protect vulnerable seniors from scams. The irony of that statement would become painfully clear soon enough. Karen's performance during that first meeting was masterful. She sat in Margaret's living room, looking at photos of Thomas, expressing sympathy for her loss, and explaining in patient, caring tones how overwhelming the home repair process could be for someone in Margaret's situation. She used just enough technical jargon to sound knowledgeable, but not so much that Margaret felt ignorant for not understanding. She promised to handle everything: the insurance claim, finding reputable contractors, negotiating fair prices, obtaining the necessary permits, and ensuring the work was done properly. All Margaret had to do was sign a consulting agreement and pay an administration fee of $8,000 to cover Karen's services, paperwork processing, and coordination costs. Karen assured her this was standard industry practice, saying the fee would actually save Margaret money in the long run by preventing contractor overcharges and insurance company denials. Margaret hesitated. $8,000 was nearly half of her remaining savings, money she had set aside for emergencies and helping her grandchildren with college expenses. But Karen was persuasive, explaining that without proper representation, Margaret's insurance claim would likely be denied, and she would end up paying far more than $8,000 out of pocket for roof repairs. Karen showed her official-looking documents, contracts filled with impressive legal language and testimonials from supposed satisfied clients. She even offered to let Margaret think about it overnight, a calculated move that made her seem less pushy and more trustworthy. Margaret, desperate to fix her leaking roof and terrified of being scammed by contractors, signed the contract the next day and wrote Karen a check for $8,000, believing she was protecting herself from dishonest people. She had no idea she was handing her life savings directly to the most dishonest person she would ever meet. For the first 2 weeks, Karen maintained the illusion perfectly. She called Margaret with updates about the insurance claim being filed, about contractors being interviewed, about permits being submitted. She used phrases like moving through the system and waiting for approval, language that sounded official enough to be believable. She even sent Margaret official-looking documents, forms that appeared to be insurance paperwork and contractor estimates, all carefully designed to look legitimate while being completely worthless. Margaret felt relieved, believing her roof would soon be repaired and her home safe again. But as weeks turned into months, Karen's calls became less frequent. Her updates became more vague. When Margaret asked specific questions about when the work would begin, Karen grew irritated, suggesting that Margaret didn't understand how long these processes took, and that her constant questions were actually slowing things down. By the 3rd month, Margaret's calls were going straight to voicemail. Her emails went unanswered. The office address on Karen's business card turned out to be nothing more than a virtual mailbox service. "Sa, do you want Margaret's roof was still leaking, now worse than before, because the damage had spread during the delay. Her $8,000 was gone. The insurance company had no record of any claim being filed on her behalf. The contractors Karen claimed to have hired had never heard of either Margaret Chen or Karen Richardson's consulting business. Margaret had been completely, thoroughly, and devastatingly scammed by a woman who had looked her in the eyes, sat in her living room, and promised to protect her from the very crime Karen was committing. The emotional devastation that followed nearly destroyed Margaret Chen. She spent weeks unable to sleep, lying awake at night listening to rainwater drip into buckets scattered around her bedroom, feeling like the biggest fool in the world. How could she have been so naive? How could she have trusted someone so completely? The shame was almost worse than the financial loss. She couldn't bring herself to tell her children at first, couldn't bear to see the disappointment in their eyes when they learned their mother had given away half her savings to a con artist. When she finally confessed what had happened, her daughter Susan immediately wanted to call the police, to hire a lawyer, to fight back against the woman who had stolen from her mother. But Margaret's son, David, always the practical one, pointed out what Margaret already feared. The police would call it a civil matter. A lawyer would cost more money they didn't have. Karen Richardson's attorney husband would bury them in legal threats and paperwork. It seemed hopeless. Margaret did eventually file a police report, her hands trembling as she tried to explain to the board desk officer how she had been scammed. The officer was sympathetic but firm. This wasn't a criminal matter in their eyes. It was a contract dispute. Margaret would need to pursue the case in civil court if she wanted her money back. But civil court required filing fees, legal representation, and the kind of knowledge about the legal system that Margaret simply didn't possess. When she tried to find an attorney willing to take her case, they all said the same thing. Yes, they could help, but their retainer fees started at $5,000, and there was no guarantee of winning or recovering the money, even if they did. Margaret was trapped in the perfect crime. Too poor to fight back, too embarrassed to make noise about it, and Karen's performance in that first meeting had been masterful. She sat in Margaret's living room, looking at photos of Thomas, expressing sympathy for her loss, and explaining in patient, caring tones how overwhelming the home repair process could be for someone in Margaret's situation. She sprinkled in just enough technical jargon to sound knowledgeable without making Margaret feel foolish for not understanding. She promised to handle everything: the insurance claim, finding reputable contractors, negotiating fair prices, obtaining the necessary permits, and ensuring the work was done properly. All Margaret had to do was sign a consulting agreement and pay an administration fee of $8,000 to cover Karen's services, paperwork processing, and coordination costs. Karen assured her this was standard industry practice, insisting the fee would actually save Margaret money in the long run by preventing contractor overcharges and insurance denials. Margaret hesitated. $8,000 was nearly half of her remaining savings. Money she had earmarked for emergencies and helping her grandchildren with college. But Karen was persuasive. Without proper representation, the insurance claim would likely be denied, and Margaret would end up paying far more than $8,000 out of pocket. Karen produced official-looking documents, contracts full of impressive legal language, and testimonials from satisfied clients. She even offered to let Margaret sleep on it, a calculated move that made her seem less pushy and more trustworthy. Desperate to stop the leaks and terrified of falling victim to unscrupulous contractors, Margaret signed the contract the next day and wrote Karen a check for $8,000, believing she was protecting herself. She had no idea she was handing her life savings to the most dishonest person she would ever meet. For the first 2 weeks, Karen maintained the illusion perfectly. She called with updates about the insurance claim being filed, contractors being interviewed, and permits being submitted. She used phrases like moving through the system and waiting for approval. Just vague enough to sound official. She sent official-looking forms and contractor estimates that were meticulously designed to appear legitimate while being worthless. Margaret felt relief and hope that her roof would finally be repaired. But weeks turned into months. Karen's calls became less frequent, and her updates more vague. When Margaret asked when the work would begin, Karen grew irritated, suggesting Margaret didn't understand how long these processes took and that her constant questions were slowing things down. By the third month, calls went straight to voicemail and emails went unanswered. The office address on Karen's business card turned out to be a virtual mailbox service. Margaret's roof was still leaking, worse than before, because the damage had spread during the delay. Her $8,000 was gone. The insurance company had no record of any claim. The contractors Karen claimed to have hired had never heard of Margaret Chen or Karen Richardson's consulting business. Margaret had been completely, thoroughly, and devastatingly scammed by a woman who had looked her in the eye, sat in her living room, and promised to protect her from the very crime Karen was committing. The emotional fallout nearly destroyed Margaret. She spent weeks unable to sleep, lying awake as rainwater dripped into buckets around her bedroom, feeling like the biggest fool. How could she have been so naive? The shame was almost worse than the financial loss. She couldn't bring herself to tell her children at first, unable to face their disappointment that their mother had given away half her savings. When she finally told them, her daughter Susan wanted to call the police and hire a lawyer immediately. But her son David, practical and steady, pointed out what Margaret already feared. The police might treat it as a civil matter. A lawyer would cost money they didn't have, and Karen Richardson's attorney husband could swamp them with legal threats and paperwork. It felt hopeless. Margaret eventually filed a police report, her hands shaking as she explained how she'd been scammed. The officer was sympathetic but clear. This didn't look like a criminal case to them. It looked like a contract dispute. To recover her money, Margaret would need to pursue civil court, which required filing fees, legal representation, and legal know-how she didn't possess. When she sought attorneys, they all gave the same response. They could help, but retainer fees started at $5,000, and there was no guarantee of winning or recovering the funds. Margaret was trapped in the perfect crime. Too poor to fight back, too embarrassed to make noise about it, and too exhausted to keep pushing against a system that seemed designed to protect people like Karen Richardson. Then, one night, as Margaret sat in her living room watching television with buckets catching the latest rainfall, she saw an advertisement for Judge Judy. She had watched the show occasionally over the years and found satisfaction in seeing entitled people face consequences. Something clicked. Judge Judy didn't require lawyer fees. Judge Judy didn't care about fancy legal maneuvers. Judge Judy cared about right and wrong, about evidence and truth. Margaret knew it was a long shot. Thousands probably applied to appear on the show, but she had nothing left to lose except her dignity. And Karen had already stolen most of that along with her money. Her daughter helped her fill out the application online, detailing the scam, attaching the fake contract, the worthless documents Karen had provided, and a bank statement showing the $8,000 check. 3 weeks later, a producer called to say Judge Judy herself had reviewed the case and wanted to hear it in her courtroom. On the day of the taping, Margaret arrived at the studio nauseous with anxiety. She had never been on television or confronted anyone so publicly. Part of her wanted to turn around and accept the loss, but she thought of Thomas, of how hard he had worked for that house, and of how disappointed he would be if she let someone steal from them without fighting back. She thought of other elderly victims Karen had likely scammed, and of her grandchildren asking why the roof still leaked months after Grandma had paid someone to fix it. Margaret walked into that courtroom determined to tell her truth, even if her voice shook, and she cried. Even if Karen and her expensive lawyer husband tried to make her feel small again. Karen Richardson strutted into the courtroom like she was walking a red carpet. Her designer suit probably cost more than Margaret's monthly pension check. Her hair and makeup were flawless. Her jewelry signaled wealth. She carried a leather portfolio and smiled at the cameras, waving to the audience as if she were the star, rather than the defendant in a fraud case. She had clearly prepared for this moment, perhaps rehearsing her lines or getting coaching from her attorney husband on handling aggressive questioning. Seti, what Karen hadn't prepared for was that Judge Judy had done her homework. Judge Judy sat at her bench reviewing the case file one final time before the cameras rolled. Having presided over cases for over 25 years, first in family court and then on television, she'd developed an uncanny ability to spot con artists in the first 30 seconds of meeting them. Margaret's story triggered something familiar. A vulnerable elderly person, a smooth-talking consultant, vague promises, an expensive fee, and then excuses and disappearances. Judge Judy instructed her producers to dig deeper. What they uncovered made her blood boil. The producers found 11 other elderly victims across 3 counties, each telling virtually identical stories. An unexpected home emergency, Karen showing up with promises to help, an $8,000 fee, fake documents, and then ghosting when questions arose. The victims had never connected the dots. Karen had carefully spaced her cons to target isolated seniors. Once the producers started calling, the scope of Karen Richardson's operation became clear. This wasn't a failed business or a misunderstanding. It was systematic, calculated fraud targeting society's most vulnerable. Judge Judy was ready to end Karen Richardson's career as a con artist in the most public and humiliating way possible. The cameras began to roll, and Judge Judy opened the case with her signature no-nonsense approach, her voice cutting through the courtroom with surgical precision. Ms. Richardson, you're being sued by Margaret Chen for $8,000. She claims you took her money, promised roof repairs and help with her insurance claim, and provided nothing in return. Tell me what happened. It was a simple, direct question, the kind Judge Judy had asked thousands of times. Karen didn't merely answer. She launched into a performance so theatrical, it exposed her instinct for manipulation. Your Honor, I run a legitimate senior consulting business that helps elderly homeowners navigate repairs and insurance claims. Mrs. Chen hired me to provide professional services, and I did exactly what our contract specified, she declared, each phrase carefully rehearsed. But Karen then made a critical mistake. Instead of sticking to facts and evidence, she attacked Margaret's character, rolling her eyes as she described Margaret's repeated calls and implying some clients simply didn't understand the process. She painted Margaret as the problem rather than the victim. Judge Judy's eyebrows lifted, a subtle but unmistakable sign that trouble was brewing. Ms. Richardson, she interrupted, professional but razor-sharp, I didn't ask for your analysis of Mrs. Chen's mental capacity. I asked what services you provided in exchange for $8,000. The question was devastating in its simplicity, slicing through Karen's verbal camouflage. Blinded by years of talking her way out of accountability, Karen responded with an exaggerated sigh and said, Well, if you'll let me finish explaining the context. Your Honor? You'll understand why this situation is more complicated than it appears. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Even the camera operators seemed frozen. Judge Judy had been doing this long enough that very few things genuinely surprised her anymore. But the sheer audacity of Karen Richardson sighing at her, treating a judge like an incompetent obstacle, was something else entirely. Judge Judy leaned forward in her chair, her famous steely gaze locking onto Karen like a heat-seeking missile that had just acquired its target. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dropping to that dangerously quiet tone that made seasoned attorneys break out in cold sweats and career criminals reconsider their life choices. "Did you just sigh at me in my courtroom?" The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. ready to sever whatever remained of Karen's false confidence. Any reasonable person would have recognized this as the moment to back down, apologize, and show some semblance of respect for the authority they were addressing. But Karen Richardson was not reasonable. She had spent years manipulating customer service workers and intimidating vulnerable elderly people. She genuinely believed she could use the same tactics on Judge Judy Schindlin. Karen smiled. Not a nervous or apologetic smile, but a condescending smirk that screamed she thought she was smarter than everyone in the room. She turned slightly toward the audience as if preparing to share an inside joke about how unreasonable the judge was being, and how she simply didn't understand the complexities of the consulting business. Judge Judy's response was swift and surgical, delivered with the precision of a master removing something malignant. Ms. Richardson, let me save us all some time here. Based on the evidence you've presented, or should I say, the complete lack of evidence, and based on your attitude in my courtroom, I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff. You owe Mrs. Chin $8,000 plus court costs. Case dismissed. The gavel came down with the finality of a guillotine blade. For most people, that would have been the end. Accept the loss, learn the lesson, walk out with whatever dignity remained. Karen's arrogance, however, was so deeply ingrained that she did something unprecedented in Judge Judy's courtroom. She exploded. Her face shifted colors with chameleon-like speed. Shock white to furious red to indignant purple in about 3 seconds. She shot up from her chair so fast it nearly toppled backward, her leather portfolio spilling papers across the floor like confetti at the world's worst celebration. "Are you kidding me right now?" Karen shrieked, her voice climbing to decibels that seemed capable of shattering glass. "This is absolutely ridiculous. You clearly don't understand basic contract law or how consulting businesses operate. I have documentation. I have precedents. You can't just ignore the evidence because you don't like my tone." The audience gasped. A collective intake of breath like wind rushing through the courtroom. Even the bailiff, who had seen everything, took an involuntary step forward, unsure whether Karen was about to require physical restraint. No one, and this cannot be emphasized enough, had ever been stupid enough to tell Judge Judy Schindlin she didn't understand the law. But Karen wasn't finished. She was only getting started on what would become the most spectacular courtroom meltdown ever captured on camera. A performance so breathtakingly arrogant it would be studied in law schools and psychology classes for years as a cautionary example of entitlement colliding with accountability. Karen pointed her finger at Judge Judy, wagging it like she was scolding a misbehaving child. "I did my research, lady. I have case precedents that completely contradict your so-called ruling. You obviously haven't been keeping up with current legal developments in contract law. Maybe if you spent less time on television and more time in actual courtrooms, you'd understand consulting fees are non-refundable, regardless of outcome." The word lady echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Karen Richardson had just called Judge Judy Schindlin, a woman who had presided over $20,000 cases and forgotten more law than Karen would ever pretend to know. "Lady," in a tone dripping with contempt. Then came the moment replayed 30 million times across every social media platform. Karen turned to face the cameras, playing to an imagined audience sympathetic to her plight, and laughed. Not a nervous or embarrassed laugh, but a full-throated, entitled laugh that announced to millions she believed herself smarter than the judge. "This is exactly why I don't watch this show," Karen told America, as if delivering a scathing movie review. She clearly has no idea what she's talking about. I mean, seriously, how hard is it to understand simple contract law and consulting business practices? The silence that followed was a void where sound itself seemed afraid to exist. Judge Judy sat perfectly still, hands folded on the bench, watching Karen's display with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction. Then, with the deliberate movement of a hurricane gathering strength before landfall, Judge Judy stood, something she rarely did, signaling to everyone that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Karen's laughter died as realization crept over her. She had made a catastrophic mistake. Judge Judy spoke the words that would go viral, and, in an instant, destroy Karen Richardson's world. "Can't touch you." "Oh, sweetheart, I'm not going to touch you." But the district attorney's office, the State Fraud Investigation Unit, and the IRS agents I spoke with last night, they're going to do a lot more than touch you. Each syllable landed like a bomb, detonating Karen's confidence with surgical precision. Her smirk vanished as if it had never existed. Color drained from her cheeks. Her hands, which had gestured confidently just moments before, began to tremble. "Wait," she stammered, suddenly small and uncertain. "What? What do you mean?" Judge Judy wasn't finished. She had been building to this moment. And now that Karen had provided the perfect setup with that idiotic, "You can't touch me" line, the judge delivered a masterclass in judicial dismantling that would echo through internet history. "Unlike your victims," Judge Judy continued, her voice carrying absolute authority and righteous fury, "they won't be confused by your fake contracts or your attorney husband's threatening letters. They'll be very, very clear about what you are. A con artist who systematically preys on elderly people, stealing their life savings while they're at their most vulnerable." The courtroom was so silent you could hear hearts beating. Karen tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. But no words came. Judge Judy reached down and picked up a thick folder that had been sitting on her bench. A folder Karen had assumed was just the basic case file. She was about to discover how wrong that assumption was. "Ms. Richardson," Judge Judy said, "you thought you were coming here for a simple civil case about one elderly widow you believed was too confused and too poor to fight back. What you didn't know is our producers spent the last 3 weeks conducting an investigation that would make professional detectives proud." Judge Judy opened the folder with deliberate slowness, letting the tension build like a conductor leading an orchestra toward its crescendo. "We contacted 11 of your previous victims," she said evenly. 11 elderly people across 3 different counties, all of whom told virtually identical stories about your consulting business. The same promises to help with home repairs and insurance claims, the same $8,000 administration fee, the same fake documents, empty updates, and eventual ghosting when they began asking difficult questions. Karen's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she gripped the edge of the defendant's table to steady herself. Her perfectly applied makeup began to run as sweat gathered across her forehead. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, that's not those people. They just didn't understand." Judge Judy's voice sliced through her excuses like a blade. "They understood, Ms. Richardson. They understood that you're a predator who's been running the same scam repeatedly, targeting the most vulnerable members of our society, believing they were too embarrassed, too confused, and too poor to hold you accountable." The evidence came out piece by piece, each revelation more devastating than the last. Judge Judy presented documents proving that Karen had never filed a single insurance claim for any of her clients. She introduced testimony from contractors who had never heard of Karen Richardson or her so-called consulting business, despite her claims of hiring them. Then she revealed bank records showing that Karen's business had never filed proper tax returns, despite collecting over $200,000 in fees from elderly victims. "The IRS is very interested in your unreported income," Judge Judy said, her tone sharp with satisfaction. "They'll be contacting you soon about your tax obligations for the last 3 years. And your attorney husband, the one you used to threaten and silence your victims, he's already been contacted by the State Bar Association. It seems there are serious ethical violations when a licensed attorney helps his spouse commit fraud and intimidate elderly victims into silence." Karen's breakdown was complete. The confident businesswoman who had strutted into the courtroom an hour earlier was gone, replaced by a trembling, sobbing wreck who could barely stand. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face, streaking her expensive makeup. "Please, Your Honor, I can explain. I made mistakes. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just trying to run a business. I didn't understand. I can pay the money back. Please, don't. You can't." Judge Judy's expression didn't soften in the slightest. "Oh, but I can, Ms. Richardson. And I am." She picked up her gavel, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. "Margaret Chen is awarded $8,000, plus maximum court costs of $2,500. But that's the least of your problems. I'm submitting this entire testimony, including your admission of running this scheme on multiple victims, to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. I'm forwarding your case to the State Licensing Board, the IRS, and Adult Protective Services for elder abuse investigation." The gavel came down with a thunderous crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. Judge Judy's final words were cold and deliberate. "You wanted to know if I could touch you. Watch what happens when the justice system finally pays attention to people like you. You're dismissed from my courtroom. Enjoy explaining all of this to the investigators who will be contacting you very soon." Karen stumbled toward the exit, barely able to walk, her designer heels clicking unevenly on the floor as she tried to flee the cameras, the audience's stares, and the wreckage of her carefully constructed life of deceit. The courtroom erupted into spontaneous applause for Margaret Chen, who sat weeping tears of relief and vindication. Other elderly victims who had come to witness the case stood and clapped, finally seeing someone hold Karen Richardson accountable for the pain she had caused so many families. Within 30 minutes of the episode airing, clips of the confrontation flooded social media. Within 2 hours, "You Can't Touch Me" was trending on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. By the end of the day, over 5 million people had watched Karen Richardson's spectacular downfall. By the end of the week, that number surpassed 30 million, and it kept climbing. The clip spread with captions like, "This is what happens when you mess with Judge Judy." The moment entitlement died on national television, and Karen learns she's not untouchable after all. Legal analysts praised Judge Judy's collaboration with law enforcement, while victim advocacy groups used the footage in campaigns to raise awareness about elder fraud, ensuring that Karen Richardson's downfall would serve as both justice and warning for years to come. Psychology professors began using the viral clip to teach lessons on narcissistic personality disorder and the dangers of unchecked entitlement. The real-world consequences for Karen Richardson came swiftly and without mercy. Within 72 hours of the episode airing, the district attorney's office filed formal fraud charges against her, citing the televised testimony as evidence, along with statements from 11 additional victims who came forward after watching the show. The IRS launched a full audit of Karen's finances for the previous 5 years, uncovering not only the unreported consulting income, but also several other financial irregularities that added tax evasion to her growing list of crimes. Her husband's law firm, eager to protect its reputation, forced him to resign immediately. Within a week, he filed for divorce, claiming fraudulent misrepresentation during their marriage and seeking to shield his assets from her legal fallout. The bank froze Karen's accounts pending the fraud case. She was forced to sell her house, cars, and most of her possessions just to pay for legal representation. 8 additional victims came forward after seeing the Judge Judy episode, filing their own lawsuits and providing prosecutors with even more evidence. The criminal trial began 3 months later and lasted just under 3 weeks. The prosecution played the entire Judge Judy episode in court, using Karen's own words and her televised meltdown as proof of her guilt and lack of remorse. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on 12 counts, including fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced Karen Richardson to 4 years in state prison and ordered her to pay over $250,000 in restitution to her victims. As she was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, someone in the gallery shouted, "Guess Judge Judy could touch you after all," drawing applause from everyone present. Margaret Chen received her full restitution plus damages, allowing her to repair her roof and restore her home. More importantly, she gained validation that she wasn't foolish, confused, or wrong to fight back against someone who had tried to steal her dignity along with her money. She went on to become an advocate for elder fraud victims, starting a support group with others who had been scammed by Karen. She appeared on several news programs, sharing her story to help seniors recognize and avoid similar schemes. In the aftermath, the state legislature passed new protections for elderly homeowners, requiring licensing and background checks for anyone offering senior consulting services. The new legislation was informally nicknamed the Karen Richardson Law, ensuring that her name would live on not as a success story, but as a cautionary tale. Judge Judy's handling of the case became legendary, both in legal circles and among everyday viewers who admired her precision and authority. The "you can't touch me" moment entered pop culture as shorthand for when arrogance finally meets accountability. The case was featured in documentaries about courtroom justice, discussed in law school ethics classes, and analyzed by communication experts studying viral media and public accountability. Karen Richardson had believed her wealth, connections, and attorney husband made her untouchable. She thought elderly victims were easy prey, too timid or confused to fight back. She thought she could talk her way through Judge Judy's courtroom with polished charm and fake legal jargon. She was wrong, catastrophically wrong, on every single count. Judge Judy delivered exactly the justice Karen Richardson deserved, and Margaret Chen had long awaited. The story became a testament to the power of truth, evidence, and accountability, and a reminder that even the most entitled fraudsters eventually face the consequences of their actions. Karen learned that lesson in the most public, most humiliating way possible, and 30 million people watched it happen in real time.